Outside of the horror films that receive limited or wide theatrical releases, outside of the horror movies that head straight to VOD or streaming, and outside of the horror movies that go straight to DVD and video, there are the horror films that are made for television, that air without context or fanfare to unsuspecting viewers who have no idea what they're in for. And just as unceremoniously as they air, made-for-TV movies often disappear from the public consciousness. Made-for-TV movies don't always receive any other form of release. The network it was made for might air it a couple of extra times sporadically, but even that isn't a guarantee. And if a made-for-TV movie does get an external release on video or streaming, it might not be until decades later, and as a result of external pressure from fans who kept the fading memory of a nearly forgotten work of art alive throughout those intervening years. Made-for-TV movies are often at risk of disappearing, and many of them likely are forever lost to time. But in this video, I'm going to highlight made-for-TV horror movies that survived for decades in the memories of those who saw them when they aired on television in the US, the UK, and Spain. If there are any other made-for-TV horror movies that have stuck in your mind for years despite their fleeting availability, share them in the comments. Let's keep the memory of these movies alive and bring them just a little bit more attention. Let's start by looking at one of the most notorious made-for-TV horror movies, 1992's Ghostwatch, which aired on Halloween night on BBC One. After this single showing, it was never aired again on British television, and it took many years for the film to be aired elsewhere and to be released on physical media. That lone airing was enough to make Ghostwatch entirely unforgettable for anyone who stumbled across it. This had less to do with the actual plot of the film and far more to do with its presentation. Ghostwatch was presented as an episode of a live investigative docu-series, and viewers were thoroughly convinced that it was real. This made Ghostwatch a pioneer of the mockumentary and found footage horror subgenres, predating the Blair Witch Project by a full 7 years. Though plenty of other films predate Blair Witch in this niche as well. It certainly popularized the style, but its persistent reputation as the originator of the found footage form is wholly undeserved. While much of Ghostwatch seems rather tame compared to most other found footage offerings, that's actually one of its biggest strengths. The mundanity of much of the broadcast serves to thoroughly sell the events as real. What happens in the film doesn't feel scripted, and the hosts of the show don't feel like they're acting. That's partly because, for the most part, they weren't traditional actors. They were real, unscripted presenters that viewers were likely to already be familiar with. For a British TV watcher in 1992, seeing the familiar face of Sir Michael Parkinson using his real name and telling you that what you're seeing is 100% real, there was no reason to doubt him. There was no reason to be suspicious, especially when he remains skeptical throughout the proceedings and consistently downplays the odds of them actually encountering anything paranormal at all. When the spooky happenings do begin, you can imagine how live viewers must have been glued to the television set, wondering what the hell was about to happen next in real time. The film is explicitly set at the exact date and time that it aired live, and they really went the extra mile to convince you that it was not just real, but really happening at that precise moment in time. There's mention of it being after the 9 o'clock watershed, little manufactured slip-ups that seem like the result of the chaotic unpredictability of a live show that nobody would think to include in a scripted production, right? But they did. And Parkinson even gives a quick explanation for why they're staying on the air longer right at the 1 hour mark, which is when this type of live show would typically be wrapping up and segueing into the next program. All of this adds up to a remarkable sense of authenticity. In describing it, it might sound like a sort of you-had-to-be-there experience when this first aired. And I do think that's true to an extent, but it still has plenty of merit when you return to it today, even with prior knowledge of its ruse. Rather than being a stunt that could only work one time during its initial airing, it's more like a rock-solid found footage or mockumentary project that had the added benefit of providing a truly special, one-of-a-kind experience for those who were lucky enough to tune in live on Halloween night 1992. There was a real phone number displayed on the screen for viewers to call into, which again would actually already be familiar to British viewers since it was the same number used by other BBC shows that took call-ins. There was supposedly a disclaimer on the hold recording that the show was fictional, but that message apparently didn't reach most people that called in. who instead only received a busy signal and surely thought that they were waiting to be connected to the on-screen telephone operators. The calls that actually came in throughout Ghostwatch are scripted and pre-recorded, but if you were watching live, would think that they had just as likely a chance of getting on the air as these secretly pre-recorded callers. And a lot of those real callers were calling to complain, as this was an extremely controversial program that caused a lot of outrage and even a lawsuit or two. There's also some disagreement and confusion over whether or not the movie was aired with a disclaimer that it was fictional at the beginning. Since it only aired one time, we're sort of left with different people's conflicting memories, and you can find sources claiming definitively that it did not air with any disclaimer, just as easily as you can find sources claiming definitively that it did have a disclaimer right at the start. Regardless, even if there was a disclaimer, any viewer who tuned in just a few seconds after the start of the broadcast would have missed that disclaimer and been totally in the dark. Everything within the film itself is designed to convince you that it's 100% authentic, and they do an incredible job of pulling that off. While it might not have the same level of impact if you stream it on Shudder in 2024, it's easy to see why Ghostwatch scarred the generations who saw it live. And it's still a great mockumentary haunted house film in isolation. Another made-for-TV ghost story that terrified an older generation of Brits was Whistle and I'll Come to You, which aired in 1968 as part of the BBC's Omnibus series. This 40-minute horror short film was a bit of an oddity amongst the rest of the series. Omnibus ran for well over 750 episodes, but the vast majority of them were documentaries and other nonfiction presentations like concerts. So even though Whistle and I'll Come to You doesn't make any attempt to pass itself off as real internally, it still had a similar effect of catching viewers off guard that Ghostwatch did. Regular viewers of Omnibus were not prepared to strap in for a chilling horror movie. Some who tuned in late may have even thought that they were witnessing a documentary with reenactments or another type of nonfiction programming instead of a scripted ghost story adapted from a short story from 1904, which was itself inspired by a poem from 1793. So this legend stretches back real far. Whistle and I'll Come to You isn't amazing, but it is solid. Its 40-minute runtime breezes right by, and it's easy to see why it would stick in the minds of terrified viewers for half a century afterward if they were caught off guard by it. Much of the film plays out simply and realistically, until the third act suddenly dives headlong into the supernatural and indulges in surreal, ghostly imagery. I'll avoid spoiling this ending, and if you want to see it for yourself, the full film is available on YouTube and plenty of other places completely for free. It hinges on cheap and obvious effects, strings and sheets, real old school ghost scares, but it works better than you might expect because of the build-up and context, and through the use of some striking low frame rate slow motion and creative sound design. Let's move to the United States now for a made-for-TV horror movie that scarred a generation of Americans when it aired unceremoniously on CBS in 1981. There's only one Dark Knight that I care about, and that's Dark Knight of the Scarecrow. The plot follows an innocent, mentally challenged man, played by the underappreciated Larry Drake, who becomes the subject of a witch hunt and is lynched over the supposed murder of a girl who isn't even dead at all and whom he actually saved from a dog attack. While fleeing the mob, he attempts to pose as a scarecrow, but is found anyway. What follows is essentially a slasher film, with this unfortunate victim seemingly stalking and murdering the members of the lynch mob one by one as a supernatural scarecrow killer. In the overcrowded slasher genre, Dark Knight of the Scarecrow stands out for a couple of key reasons. The first is just how sympathetic this killer is. You are fully on his side from the get-go. Some slasher movies get you rooting for the villain purely because all of the victims are such huge douchebags, but this sympathetic approach is far more effective and didn't get in the way of this made-for-TV horror movie scaring the hell out of its audience, as evidenced by the swaths of people who remembered being traumatized by it when it resurfaced on Shudder in 2022, after being much harder to get a hold of for many, many years. That same year, 2022, also saw the release of a long-delayed sequel, but even though the original writer returned and jumped into the director's chair this time, Dark Knight of the Scarecrow 2 didn't land with the same long-lasting resonance as the original. Dark Knight of the Scarecrow also stands out through its subtlety and restraint. Since it was made as a TV movie for CBS, it couldn't revel in the blood and gore like theatrically released and straight-to-video slasher films could. This sounds like something that would hamstring the film, but the opposite was true. The guardrails in place forced the team to get creative with the kills and rely far more on subtlety, tension, dread, and implied violence than it surely would have otherwise, for a strong net positive in the end. It's not mind-blowing, nor would I go so far as to call it a highlight of the slasher genre, but it is a solid and original entry in the supersaturated slasher sector, and it deserves a lasting legacy rather than the forgotten fate that befalls many made-for-TV movies. Rounding out our world tour of made-for-TV horror movies, let's head to Spain for The Telephone Box, or La Cabina. This film aired in 1972 on Television Española, which is Spain's official state-owned broadcast brand. After this initial airing, The Telephone Box was only sporadically seen over the years, occasionally airing on Spanish TV and on TV in other countries, but it largely languished in forgotten nightmares until Television Española decided to release it on its archival YouTube channel with English subtitles in 2019. And I mentioned English subtitles, but The Telephone Box functions just as well, even if you were to watch it without subtitles and without understanding the language. There is some basic dialogue within The Telephone Box, but the vast majority of this roughly 35-minute film unfolds without any dialogue whatsoever. Instead, we get an emphasis on crystal clear visual storytelling that doesn't need language to establish its central character, convey its sci-fi surreal concept, or to get its sense of terror across. The short begins with mysterious men setting up a phone booth. Later on, our protagonist enters the phone booth, tries and fails to make a call because this is no ordinary phone booth, and is then unable to leave. Despite his and a crowd of onlookers' best efforts, nothing can extricate him from the confines of his metal and plexiglass coffin. It's a premise that's a stone's throw away from being a Mr. Bean sketch revolving around physical comedy, but it instead mines suspense from that situation. I won't spoil what happens since I encourage you to watch it for yourself right here on YouTube, but I will say that The Telephone Box continues to build upon this simple premise throughout its entire duration, consistently ratcheting up the tension like a great sci-fi thriller until it gets downright nightmarish in its final minutes and ends with a hell of a bang. If you're ready to dig a bit deeper this Halloween and explore some horror time capsules, then I highly recommend each of these made-for-TV horror movies for a good spooky time that we as horror fans shouldn't let be lost just because of their format and release. And again, if there are any made-for-TV horror movies that scarred you in your youth, drop their titles in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, you can support the channel on the newly launched Patreon, which provides bonus content for both this channel and my side channel, Brickwall Unplugged. Due to YouTube's bullshit copyright dispute system, that Patreon is currently the only place where you can see my gigantic top 250 films of all time video, which I've been trying to release here on YouTube for months at this point, and got nothing to show for it except some copyright strikes. Anyway, I'll see you next time. Happy Halloween, everyone.